Hey guys, welcome to episode 53 of the Strength System podcast. This is Varun here as always. I'm joined today by Nivedhan,
Hey guys.
doing a repeat appearance. So I am fueled up by coffee, Madras Coffee House. If you guys want to do a coffee sponsorship, we're always willing. We'll accept payment in coffee. But at least I am fired up. I think Nivedhan's fired up to talk about mobility today.
Oh yeah.
Right? So mobility, I feel like it's been floating around in the fitness industry for a long time, but it's probably one of those buzzwords that's really topical right now. You'll see posts on Instagram talking about improve your mobility. If you don't have these mobility requirements, you can't do this movement. Hey, can you do this weird random stretch? If you can't, then you need to improve. And it's just a word that's thrown around a lot, but nobody really knows what it means, I think. And with the result that everybody thinks they lack mobility and they need to train it, and everybody's very confused by it. So maybe we should start with like a working definition of what mobility is. What do you think mobility is?
So I think mobility is the ability to control a certain range of motion in a joint. I think one way of thinking about it is the interjection of, like Mike Israetel says, interjection of strength and flexibility. Okay, can you go into that range of motion? Can you control that range of motion? That is mobility, which means you can actually like work from there or resist external resistance from there, right? So by flexibility, I just mean, okay, if you lie on your back and then like pull your knee up to your chest, how far does it go? Okay, that's how much flexibility you have. Right. That is not really determinant of any physical performance for sure, but that's flexibility. And when you do a squat, can you go to the same range of motion? If you can't, your mobility is slightly different. Now, just because it is lesser than that, it doesn't really mean it's a death sentence. Your back is not going to like get thrown out of place. Nothing of that sort is going to happen. But yeah, I think a good way to think about it is like interjection of flexibility and strength.
Okay, so I guess put simply, it's passive versus active, right? So I think flexibility is just passive ability to just get into certain positions. I think the classic kind of example of this is like a sit and reach test, right? Where or that hamstring stretch that everybody does, where you just sit on the floor, legs are straight in front of you, and you try and touch your toes. And inevitably, most people can't really get there, and then they feel bad about themselves because they can't. Something that's more active would be perhaps maybe you're hanging leg raise, right? You're hanging from the bar, you're trying to lift your knees, your feet up to your head. That's active range of motion. You're using muscular contraction to achieve that position. And I think that's also the difference in a way between flexibility and mobility. Unfortunately, when most people think of mobility, that's not what they think about, right? So I was making a list when we were making notes for this podcast, and some of the stuff you'll find under mobility: foam rolling, right? Lying down on the foam roller, rolling your glutes, hamstrings, upper back, any calf, I don't know, anything else. Self-myofascial release generally. So using lacrosse balls, using all those painful like mobility devices that you find. There's even vibrating like foam rollers. I found out about this recently.
Yeah, I don't know where the mobility industry is going.
Yeah. I think you also have just good old stretching, right? Whether it's like a passive stretch, it's active, dynamic stretching. I think those also kind of fall under the rubric of mobility work. I think when people think of mobility, they also think about banded stuff, right? So face pulls, those pointless like shoulder rotations which you do for sets of 20 before you bench press. Activation work, of course. So like glute activation, all of that kind of stuff where you put a band around your knees, take like 20 steps one way, one and the other way to get your glutes working. Even like low impact, low load mobility drills. For instance, like a thoracic spine rotation. You're on in a crawl kind of position, hands in the back of your head, you're rotating your elbow down and up. Maybe even like flow stuff, right? I mean, people do like these mobility flows and like scorpion to fornicating gorilla. I think that's one I put up on my blog at one point. But they have like these animal like names which they attach to certain poses and they flow from one to the other, and apparently that builds mobility. So it's very confused, right? There's so many things, and I think as coaches we have gone through all these phases, or most of them, right?
Right.
So it's not like we are exempt from criticism. But I think the first thing we need to point out is that you need to understand what mobility really means. And we would like to reclaim mobility. It's not any of those things we really listed. It's basically, can you actively get your joints to a particular range of motion? That's mobility.
Right.
Would you like, where do you think this fascination with like mobility really comes from though? Like everybody feels like they lack it, but where do you think it's from?
So I don't remember the exact literature or where it was first brought up, but I do think looking at some correlations between injury mechanisms in athletes and range of motion at certain joints, and as they go through the season where there are range of motion deficits happening at various joints, important joints that perform some important functions in that particular sport, and injuries seem to increase. And while that correlates, there is nothing to point that this caused that. I think that is one of the major parts and portions of the literature where this comes from.
Yeah. I think the sit and reach test, for example, that I spoke about, it's like a classic in literature, and especially they take stuff like people like army recruits, sports people, athletes, and they have them do these sit and reach tests, and then they follow them over the course of a season and see who got injured. And funnily enough, if you actually look at that research, there's no real correlation. You can be quite stiff, and there's no increased likelihood of injury. You can be really bendy, and you can still get injured. So there's no real relations you can draw out from that. So I think one other reason is there's a bit of a stereotype, right, of people who train at a gym, of lifters being like these really muscle-bound, tight, stiff people. I don't know if it comes from just seeing high-level bodybuilders, powerlifters who are just huge, right? They've spent years training. They've built up a considerable amount of muscle mass. They probably train very restricted movement patterns, and
exactly.
The problem there is not the training. I mean, it's not the fact that they're lifting weights. It's kind of how they're lifting it, and the fact that they're probably just doing repetitive movements over and over again. They're not exploring other ranges of motion, and they probably don't need to. Like for a powerlifter, do you really need to be very mobile? Not very much. You need to meet the requirements of the sport. For bodybuilding, again, you need to look good on stage. That's it. But to extrapolate from that and say, hey, everybody who trains at a gym is going to be stiff, or weight training makes you stiff, is just false.
I also think it's there's a bit of confirmation bias as well. It's easier to believe that, because let's say you go to the gym for the first time, you train, you're gonna be sore the next day. Stuff is gonna quote unquote feel stiff, and that happens a few times, and we suddenly now believe that, okay, if I lift weights, I'm going to be sore and stiff, so I need to do stretching and other stuff to relieve this tightness, right? Because temporarily, if you do stretch after lifting and when you're sore, there is going to be some kind of a relief. And that can be said for anything. You can, we've tried at the gym, you can make someone lie on their back and then scratch their ear, and their hamstring mobility sometimes increases. It's just, I think I think embracing uncertainty is a big problem, where we just don't know what led to that. It's just that it happened. That's it. Do we need to worry about it? Not really.
Yeah. So maybe let's move on to what we think are the big problems with mobility training as is commonly understood, right? So by mobility, again, I mean all those things we spoke about earlier: stretching, release work, body weight exercises where you just kind of flop from one position to the other, banded exercises. So I would say exercises that don't involve external resistance, and with the express purpose of only improving range of motion, right? So you're not trying to get any other real training effect. You want to improve range of motion in certain joints. I'll maybe just get us started. And I think the first big problem is you're assuming there's a big clean separation between mobility and strength, right? That they're two separate qualities. I mean, you kind of alluded to this earlier a little bit, but we kind of assume that you can be mobile without being strong, and that you can really be strong without being mobile, which is not really true, because I would say for a lot of people who have a quote-unquote mobility problem. They just have a strength problem. And we see lots of folks who come in, they're new to training, maybe coming to strength system is the first time they've been exposed to weight training. And one of their complaints is, I'm always stiff, I'm just tight, I need to improve my flexibility. That's what they tell us. And we're like, okay, cool. When we actually get them training consistently, when they add some load, they learn the basic movement patterns, they squat to, as a full depth, they learn a good hip hinge, they do an overhead press, they become more mobile, like no question.
Yeah.
We don't really do any extra strength work, but any mobility work, sorry. But just doing the basic strength work for somebody who is just weak, I think will build your mobility.
For sure.
Right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, completely. So even with like when we say someone can be like strong without being mobile and all of that, right? It's like we somehow, like you said, we somehow assume that mobility is like a quality in itself.
Yeah.
Like being able to be like your muscles' ability to express force, right? It's not really that. It is, I would say, more so it is like a skill. If you've been squatting to a powerlifting depth with a certain weight, and when you try to go lower, you're not able to hit that weight, does that mean you're not strong enough, or does that mean you're not mobile enough? I would just say you haven't practiced that skill. That's literally just it.
Right. Yeah. So I think our first point here is that a good training program will build mobility.
Yeah.
Right. So if you do, check off the basic patterns, you're taking weight overhead, you're rowing some weight, you are pushing some weight, you are squatting, you're doing a hip hinge, any variation doesn't matter. You can use dumbbells, barbells, kettlebells. Doesn't really change the fact that if you work all these angles and positions, these are the same positions you are pretty much going to encounter in daily life.
Right.
It's rare unless you're like a gymnast, or you're in some slightly freakish sport like mixed martial arts, which requires extreme control and range of motion. The stuff you do in the gym, I think, is going to stand you in good stead for most things you'll face in life.
For sure.
Right. I think the second point is that becoming more mobile, improving mobility, however you want to measure it, does not give you any measurable benefit, right? It doesn't decrease your injury risk. It doesn't necessarily improve your performance. It won't necessarily make you stronger. So, for example, if let's say you think you have tight ankles, right? And you spend, 20 minutes a day doing some kind of ankle, maybe you foam roll your calf first, then you do some static stretching for it, then you do some dynamic mobilization drills against the wall, and you'll probably get a little bit of an increase in your range of motion. But will that immediately translate to getting better at a squat, to being able to play a sport better? I don't really know, and I certainly don't think. Anecdotally, I've seen plenty of examples of people who spend a lot of time on that and they don't see an improvement.
For sure, yeah. I have not seen anyone see improvements in performance or see any kind of injury risk reduction just by working on mobility.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the research, we don't want to spend too much time talking about this because it's like a whole rabbit hole. But if you have to read one paper, if you're interested, we'll just mention one. I think there's a paper by James Nuzzo, Nuzzo, and the title is, let me just look it up. Flexibility is not okay, never mind. I'll get that title for you. We'll put in the show notes.
Is it the case for retiring flexibility as a component of major fitness?
Yes, that's it.
So, as a major component of fitness, sorry.
Yeah, that's the one. So it's a decent paper, 2020. Gives you all the references you need, like 200 plus citations. So if you're interested in flexibility, do read that. But yeah, so increasing range of motion, becoming more mobile does not necessarily decrease injury risk or anything else. Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just like an example, right? Just to get an idea of how to think about it, because we're just talking in like terms. It doesn't. We're not really throwing any examples. Let's say you play some sport. Let's say you play basketball or whatever sport for that matter, right? You're going to fall down on the. Let's say you're falling down on the field of sport, and then you have to get up quickly and jump in a direction and run away. Let's say that puts you in a range where your knees are nearly at your hips when you're on the floor and stuff like that, right? Now, by stretching your let's say quads, and by like say trying to improve range of motion at your hips by doing mobility drills, when you actually find yourself in that position in a field of sport, and when you have to like exert force from there and jump, are you really prepared for it just by doing that flexibility work? Or would you be better off doing like a deep squat and actually like exerting force from there? That would be, I think that deep squat would be a much better option, because you're learning to control the range of motion and you're learning to like exert force from that range of motion.
Yeah.
So I hope that kind of like helps tie these things together into a practical example.
Yeah, definitely. We'll kind of touch on like more practical examples, I think, as we go through it. So I think the third point is that just from an efficiency perspective, right? I don't think it's a very productive use of your training time. I mean, most of us aren't athletes or professional lifters, right? We don't like live to train. So most people have a limited amount of time every week to actually go to the gym and do some deliberate physical activity. For most people, it's anywhere from 3 to maybe 5-6 hours maximum out of the week. So you want to make the best possible use of that time. And what we've found is that, through trial and error, because again, we've had phases where we do a lot of mobility work, and just looking back, we realize it's usually a waste of time. If you have only so much time to devote, I would say spend more of it in strength work. All the stuff we spoke about earlier. Maybe obviously a little bit of time to like heart rate conditioning work if you need it. You could even like walk. I would rather you do walk than spend time doing mobility work, really. But just from a productivity perspective, what are you getting out of everything you're doing? I think strength training with load is going to give you a much better effect than any mobility drill you could ever do. And I think that comes down to like stress, right? And stress from like good stress perspective, like what kind of load are you putting on your tissues? Do you want to just talk a little bit further about that?
Yeah, so I was thinking about similar stuff when you were talking about this. So I think with like training, okay, the common belief I think is that if you don't work on this mobility stuff when you squat or when you deadlift or when you bench press, right, like you can injure yourself. That's the belief. That's why people want to spend so much time warming up doing mobility stuff, right? So like thinking about everything you do in the gym as like a skill kind of, I think, puts things into perspective and helps form like good ideas around training. So if you want to squat and let's say you can't squat 60 kilos to depth, right, like that's a stress you can't handle. Maybe you reduce the stress by reducing the load on the bar, because you still want range of motion. You don't want to sacrifice range of motion. You are looking for that range of motion. So let's say you reduce the stress by going down to 40 kilos and you start practicing squatting lower than you normally do. And let's say you do that during your warm-up sets, and then when you get to your work set, you work with the range you have. Because if your goal is to build strength, build muscle, like moving more load, progressive overload is more important than anything else over a period of time. And just because you can't squat to a certain depth, you're not going to get injured, right? So I think that way, like thinking of like training stress as like, okay, what can I handle? Do I have the skill to be able to handle this? Thinking in those terms, I think makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the last point, quickly before we move to the next bit, is I think it just creates further barriers to training. So we've seen this so often, right, where maybe it's our fault, or a client has gone to some other physio or coach who's told them this, and it kind of gets ingrained that they need to do mobility work in order to do lifting, right? Like they'll say, hey, if I don't do this hamstring stretching before I deadlift, I'm going to hurt my back. Or if I don't do face pulls before I bench, my shoulders are going to hurt. And what that does is it just creates further barriers which don't need to be there to actually training productively, right? So there's no evidence that doing any of this stuff before you lift will decrease any injury risk, will decrease pain. If it really has any effect, it's probably just placebo.
Exactly.
Right? And what we find is that it just gets in the way of people enjoying their workouts, getting something out of it, and actually training like productively. So if you're a coach, somebody who works with people, I think, again, just a reminder to like check your language that you use. And even if you're having people do hamstring stretching or face pulls or something before they work out, don't tell them you have to do this so you don't get hurt on the main moves. You can phrase it like a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, Don't get me wrong, we still do like some of this in the Spider-Man lunge type stretches and stuff like that in our warm-up.
Yeah.
That is not necessarily to improve flexibility so that your lifting is better. It is just so that you get some movement in before you start lifting to kind of like feel a little better, if I can say that. It doesn't necessarily do anything. Would that person be just as fine doing a few more sets of squats with the empty bar and maybe a lighter weight? For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so those are our big points against mobility training, right? But at this point, you might be thinking, so do these guys like literally just do squat, bench, deadlift, and nothing else? Is that what they're like telling us to do? And that couldn't be further from the truth as well, because like we said, there's no clean separation between strength and mobility. If you strength train the right way, you are going to get more mobile. There's no two ways about it. And we have certain ways we implement mobility training in our programming. And we found over years that this is relatively effective. And it's obviously something that's constantly evolving. Some of these things, like the movement variability stuff we're going to talk about, is fairly news over the last few months that we've started incorporating it. But maybe we'll just go through these, just summarize our thoughts on what mobility you really need and how you can incorporate it. Let me just start off. So I think the first one is just do a brief dynamic warm-up, right? So I think Nivedhan kind of mentioned this already, but we don't want to waste time just doing like passive things like stretching, foam rolling, which essentially, if you think about it, kind of down-regulate your system. When you train, you want to be a little bit aroused mentally, you want to be stimulated, you want to be ready to go. So even your warm-up, I think, should play a part in that, right? So
for sure.
The warm-up is sometimes where you can expose yourself to somewhat more of these 3D kind of things, right? Where you maybe ahead of a squat session, you can do a lunge matrix that Nivedhan mentioned. You do a forward, reverse, sideways, lateral lunge, do a rotational lunge. You can do throws, med ball throws, you can do jumps. So basically expose your body to slightly different stresses. Non-sagittal plane, or just not straight up and down stuff, but you do some rotational movement, do some lateral movement, and you can get a good amount of variety there. Spend maybe 5, maximum 10 minutes on this. Idea is to just get your nervous system amped up, get your blood flow going, get a break of sweat, and just feel ready to train. I think that's the big first point we have.
Yeah, and I think like doing this, like for example, before a squat workout, why do you need to do a lunge matrix? Can you just do a squat to warm up? Yeah, sure you can.
Yeah.
But if you're like a beginner and you've not been training for a very long time, and you want to build a base of like movements where you can like draw from a lot more, and also to kind of like build some work capacity, aerobic capacity by going through these movements without a break. I think this is a great idea. Doing stuff like crawls, push-ups with different hand positions, lunges in different directions, or just like rolling around on the floor, exploring movements on all fours, stuff like that, I think can generally help develop certain qualities like coordination and stuff, especially if you're not exposed to a lot of physical activity. I think that can be very valuable. But outside of that, I don't see any real need to do any of this. And again, I think it's important, like he mentioned, where if you're a beginner, you're just starting out, I don't even think you need to worry about this. Just get in, start your strength work, and you're good to go. If you've been training for a while, you want to experiment a little bit. I think that's where you can start throwing in some of this dynamic warm-up stuff. I think point number 2 is, again, building off of this, is just doing programming more variability during your strength work, right? So we keep talking about movement variability. We keep alluding to it. What you want to just expand a little bit further on what it is. And So movement variability doesn't necessarily mean like doing like very poles apart looking movements all the time, stuff like that. It's just making small variations to the existing foundational movement patterns themselves. For example, changing your stance width on the squat, where you hold the bar. Maybe you put the bar slightly lower on your back or slightly higher up on your back. Stuff like that, I think, can have a huge impact in how robust you can be. I think expressing these minor variations in how stress is exposed, how your body is exposed to these stresses, I think can have a huge impact on like how your joints can deal with these things. And if you're looking at mobility to reduce injury risk, stuff like that, I would actually say making these small introducing these small variabilities in the major movements that you do themselves would probably be a much better idea.
Definitely. I mean, there's so many things you can play with, right? You can change tempos. You can add pauses, you can change angles a little bit, you can change the way you load it. So for example, you could do front squats instead of back squats, you could do Zercher squats for a cycle. You could change the angle on the bench, so slight incline on the bench, slight decline. Obviously, there's a limit to variety, and you want to stick to one variation for a little bit of time to make sure you actually build some strength in that variation. But I would say, roughly every 3 to 6 weeks, you can probably look to switch up at least your assistance exercises. Maybe the main exercise you might want to keep a little bit longer if you have a specific goal. But I think if you're looking at training for a lifetime, then certainly these minor variations, you're not completely changing everything about it. Just little tweaks here and there. And I think it also just adds variety, right? And keeps you interested. If you do the same goblet reverse lunge every day for 52 weeks of the year, you're going to get bored and you're going to half-ass the exercise. But if you just make a slight tweak, okay, I'm going to take really short steps today and pause at the bottom for 2 seconds every time. It's going to shift the emphasis and it'll immediately feel fresh like a new exercise. So I think you can change your intent also when you do that.
Yeah.
I think point 3 is from a more macro perspective, when you program, covering all, quote unquote, all the angles for a particular movement. So for example, I think the classic gym bro Monday chest workout is get in, swing your hands, do some of these, lie down on the barbell, do a barbell bench press, just 3 sets of 10, knock it out, then move over to the dumbbell bench press, knock out 3 sets there, then maybe you might do an incline or a decline bench, you might do some flies. The common thing here, you're not really changing the angle, right? You're always doing everything in that more or less horizontal push kind of way. And an alternative, right? Instead of doing that, you could start with the barbell bench press. Maybe instead of doing a dumbbell bench, you could go on to dips. So now, rather than your hands being in front of you, in your dips, your shoulders are going behind you into shoulder extension. Essentially, you're working a slightly different angle. And you could do an overhead press. Again, you're doing 3 different types of presses. So the training effect is not very different, but now you're going overhead, you're going in front of you, and you're going behind you. So I do think that is going to bulletproof you a lot more than just doing bench, and flies. Do you want to just throw out some other examples of how this might work in your programming?
Yeah. Even with for example, okay, we'll stick to the fundamental patterns, I guess, just to keep it simple. Like I spoke about on the squat, right? Let's say you put the bar high up on your back. It changes how much you load your legs, how much you load your posterior chain, your glutes, your lower back, and stuff like that. And let's say from there you go into you do the squats, and then after that you do some, let's say, lunges, forward lunges or something. This now tremendously changes the torso angle. You're not bent forward as much, you're a lot more upright, but you're still working similar muscle groups. And let's say after that you go and do some leg extensions or a sled drag, reverse sled drag. Still working the same muscles, but just a different planes, different kinds of stresses. It's not even the same straight weight moving all the time. So I think these different stresses, exposure to varied stressors is what is probably going to make you more robust and resilient, not necessarily the stretching or the one activation drill that you're doing to wake up a sleeping muscle or anything of that sort.
Yeah. So I think we're just running up on time, so we'll wrap this up a little bit quickly. I think the last big point I want to make before we close is that the easiest way to implement mobility training is use a full range of motion, right? So for instance, like you see somebody struggling with a back squat, and maybe they don't even hit parallel depth, and then they blame their tight hip flexors or quads or ankles or knees or something, when the solution could just be that you need to change, maybe you need to drop the load, or you need to change the variation, maybe you need to add a box, you need to make some tweak to ensure that you're actually getting a full range of motion. So obviously an experienced coach could help you with this a little bit better, but rather than looking to throw out the kitchen sink and blame your joints, I think just making sure you hit a full range of motion when you train can go a long way to actually building mobility, right? So touching your chest with the bar on a bench press.
Right.
Getting down to like maybe a parallel position on a hinge where your torso is parallel to the floor. You might have to make tweaks. You might have to elevate your heels, widen your stance, do whatever you need to do. But often finding that correct variation and getting that full range of motion is, really the biggest, easiest way you can build your mobility. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up here. Quick summary. Mobility is overrated. You don't need to lie down on the floor. You don't need to use resistance bands. You don't need to activate anything. If you have a good, well-designed training program which works you through a full range of motion, you're working all the basic movement patterns, you are going to be pretty much bulletproof for what you need to do in life. This is particularly applicable if you're, just like us, general population, you don't have any crazy athletic goals. You just want to be healthy for life. Strength train, be happy, don't worry so much about mobility. You probably have enough of it.
Yeah.
So, I think that about wraps it. Thank you for listening, everyone. We will see you next week.
Bye, guys.